Good afternoon, comrades. Welcome to the National Food Crisis Forum. The National Food Crisis Forum was inaugurated by the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and the Cooperative and Policy Alternatives Center on Friday, the 22nd of May in 2020. It was inaugurated to address the food crisis, to link together food sovereignty systems, to link different actors and activists as well as communities, and to engage in deeper and systemic debates about the global food system. We know that contrary to the media narrative that the problems of the global food system cannot solely be blamed on the coronavirus or the war in Ukraine. In 2014, the number of people classified as hungry and malnutrition was 607. But in 2019, it was already 650 million people. So prior to COVID, the number of people classified as hungry, as malnutrition was already going up. Because the fact is the global industrial food system and its agro-monopolies has failed. Hence, we need to urgently work fast in building food sovereignty pathways and alternatives. And that is what the National Food Crisis Forum has been about. But this is a special National Food Crisis Forum, and that will also be having a book launch by Hein Marais, who will transition in the second part of the National Food Crisis Forum to launch Hein Marais' new, timely and exciting book, In the Balance, the Case for Universal Basic Income in South Africa. But the first part of the National Food Crisis Forum will have inputs, one from Mervyn Abrahams, who's coordinating research at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group. And Mervyn, thank you so much for always availing yourself to be part of the National Food Crisis Forum and help us make sense of the food crisis in our country and the skyrocketing food inflation. Mervyn will give us a 10-minute input. After him, we'll have Dr. Ferrial Adam, who's been working on water issues for over 15 years. She's an expert on some of on water issues at a national as well as international level. We'll also have a 10-minute input from Awande Buthelezi, who's a researcher and organizer for Copac and activist of the Climate Justice Charter movement. And then we'll transition to the book launch of Hein Marais' very timely book on the Universal Basic Income Grant. I'm sure we've been aware that UBIC has been making news as of late. We heard this morning that the ruling party, the African National Congress, is proposing a PIG of 350 to be debated in its upcoming policy conference. We saw Business Unity South Africa, the biggest business group, warning against the Universal Basic Income Grant. On an IntelliDex report, they were saying that the best way to fund the UBIC is by raising that by 2 percentage points. That was their proposal. We saw Development Enterprise publishing a report saying a UBIC would be a big mistake. However, I just want to remind all of us that on the 18th of February 2021, the Climate Justice Charter movement and the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign and its allies released a package of documents regarding the implementation of the UBIC. This transformative policy proposal document was titled the UBIC Now Policy Approach and Proposals, was released on the 18th of May in 2021. UBIC Approach and Scenarios document was also launched. These documents, which have been prepared by leading heterodox economists, have shown that physical constraints are not an obstacle to realizing a UBIC. These economic models show that a UBIC could be implemented in a physically neutral manner, which will not increase debt to GDP ratio, which is what it requires is a firm commitment to tackle inequality through redistributive taxation regime. Now we understand UBIC as a democratic systemic reform, not as an isolated technocratic policy, but part of a larger strategy towards a more just and egalitarian society. That is why we are starting this National Food Crisis Forum. We're discussing the food crisis, the climate crisis, and the water crisis, because the convergence of crises are creating an unlivable society where millions are disillusioned, and they are creating a country that is vulnerable to instability and to social collapse. I will hand over to Mervyn Abrahams for his 10-minute input. And again, Mervyn, thank you so much for always availing yourself, and thank you for it.
Thank you, comrade, and good afternoon to everybody on the call. And thanks again for the invitation. And it's timely that we have well-researched, progressive ideas around the basic income grant. So thank you to Hein Marais for his important book. Just to talk about the Household Affordability Index, so the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group, as you know, we track the price of a basket of 44 foods around Johannesburg, around Cape Town, around Durban, around Pietermaritzburg, and around Springbok. And then we publish on a monthly basis what the cost of that basket is on average in these cities. And in July, our basket has yet again increased. So there's been a straight spike of increase since February. You know, there's been increases, of course, for years, as Charles had mentioned, pre-COVID and so on. But since February of this year, we had seen just an upward trajectory without even a balancing out or a coming down of the cost of this basket. So in the end, in July, our basket now stands at 4,748 Rand and 87 cents. Now, this is an increase of 60 Rand over last month, over June, and it's a 611 Rand and 44 cents increase over July of last year, so over the year, which translates into a 14% increase in the cost of the basket over the past year, which of course is much more significant than the food price inflation that Stats SA puts out, which currently stands at 9%. So our basket is showing that for ordinary working class and low income households, actually inflation runs much higher. We all know that. And that our basket tend to be between 5 and 6% more in terms of inflation than that of Stats SA. Just to give comrades a brief overview on how prices have increased. So for instance, if we look at a 30 kg of maize meal, we'll see that it's increased by about 19% over the last year. 10 kgs of flour have increased by 27%. SAMP has increased by 23%. Cooking oil has increased by 64%. 6 cans of pilchard fish has increased by 21%. Margarine by 13%, and brown bread by 14%. So there's a general constant increase in the price of food. When we look in July, we will see that 31 out of the 44 foods that we tracked has shown some level of increase over the past month. However, it's one thing just talking about food prices, you know, and we cannot consider food price inflation in isolation from what is actually happening in the household basket and budget. So when we look, for instance, at the household budget, then we see, and if we take like the national minimum wage, so if a worker had earned or a household had a one wage come in set at the national minimum wage, that would probably have brought in something like 3,895 Rand. But when we consider transport, which of course has also increased on the 1st of July, or sorry, on the 1st of July, then we see that for a worker who has to take 2 taxis, on average, will spend about 1,344 Rand just on transport. And when we look at about 350 kilowatts of electricity prepaid, will cost you on average about 787 Rand. Now, just those 2 expenses already comes to about 2,131 Rand, which then leaves 1,764 Rand for food. So what we are actually seeing is that whilst households have less income to spend on food because of all the other increases, we haven't even spoken about debt servicing. While that is increasing, of course, at the same time, food prices are increasing. And the net effect of that is that households are coming back from the retail stores with less and less and less food in their shopping bag. And when we look at that, we have to begin to isolate, okay, so what are the root causes of some of these factors? It's not only around food price inflation. I mean, we often see these levels of cycles of increases, and one of the big spikes has been global commodity prices and has been global fuel prices, which of course with import parity prices, even if the sunflower is grown in outside of Bloemfontein, we're still paying almost import level prices. So those are all contributing to a massive household affordability index. And so our position has been that actually the main way in which households can protect themselves or survive against cyclical increases in basic expenditure is through savings. But of course, with historically low wage trajectory in South Africa, households cannot save. And because they cannot save, they are therefore caught up in the crisis we are seeing now. So it's yes, it is about a food system that is not totally geared towards profit, industrial corporate food system, which is very inefficient and which wastes a massive amount of food, but also, and the answer to that is more localized, more small scale farming, but it is also around wages, and it is also about decent work and decent household income in order to allow households to be able to not only afford the food, but all the basic foods, all the basic household expenditure, but as well as the ability to save for times when there are geopolitical or global crises which impact on essential prices. So I will just leave that at that point, comrade. And if anyone has any questions, of course, we can. I'm free to or open to engage.
Thank you so much, Mervyn, for such an important input. You've made it very clear that the household budget can no longer afford the industrial corporate food system, and many people, the price, the cost of living is just unbearable. It's destroying a lot of people and a lot of families, creating this unlivable society that we find ourselves in. So thank you very much, Mervyn. Awande, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Charles. I'm just gonna try share my screen quick.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's just, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone. I will try and make sure that I am also on time, as Mervyn was before me. And I'm just going to speak briefly about the worsening climate crisis, just to also bring into consideration with this conversation, as we've covered in previous national food crisis forum meetings, trying to bring the context of the global position which we're in, and also the work that impacts on these questions of food prices and also people's ability to live within the space. So speaking with regards to South Africa and the African continent as a hotspot, but more generally also speaking to the vulnerability that we're facing, I think it's also known or understood by everyone that South Africa and the African continent are in a particularly vulnerable position when it comes to the climate crisis. Not only are we exposed to comparatively stronger climate change, and this is confirmed by the IPCC's sixth assessment report, that our continent and our region of the world will be heating at a higher rate compared to the rest of the planet. We've seen these impacts ranging from the current heat waves that are being experienced in the Northern Hemisphere, but the large amount of rainfall that we've experienced in this part of the world, particularly the conditions that were faced in the province of KwaZulu-Natal in the past couple of months. Also, we lack coping capacity. It's obvious to most of us that the inequalities that we face in this country, the financial, economic, and structural level, would exacerbate some of these impacts, and it will only make the conditions that people are currently living under worse with these growing impacts from continued heating. Obviously, we lack the disaster management systems that we require. I think that the flooding in KZN and how a province of that size, that large of a population, also in the way in which they have not been attended to, the way in which the government has not been able to respond effectively to what was happening there, is only hammered home the kind of dire situation we are in if we are to face multiple impacts across the country, ranging from the flooding in KZN, wildfires, and other kind of natural climatic events that will occur with the heating world, but also the changing climate that we'll be facing across this country. The amount of money that we've seen governments think and speak around with regards to adaptation and also being able to protect our economy from the sensitivities that will come with this changing environmental conditions has been lackluster and slow or sluggish, to put it better. And then finally, also seeing the region of the continent in which we're in, we're already a semi-arid country, which will only become drier and warmer, but not just dry and warmer, sorry, but drastically drier and warmer. And I think that the past decade, with the droughts that we were facing in large parts of the country, the damage that did to the agricultural sector, were obviously a test drive or a dress rehearsal for what we're looking at when we are thinking around multi-year droughts, continued heat waves, and them happening with greater frequency and severity, and what that would mean for both the maize, crop, cattle industry in South Africa, amongst other things. I think something also which we should also take into consideration with the changes that are coming into place and the changes that we can expect, particularly at the continental level, are the kind of patterns in which these things are happening. So the latest assessment report by the IPCC, looking at the changing patterns since the fourth assessment report was 2007. So in that period of time, we're seeing a minor extension of deserts and desertification and a reduction in the total area of vegetation across the continent. Drier places such as this, and probably towards North and Western Africa, closer towards the Sahel region, particularly affected by these changes. The second is a substantial rise in human impact within the vegetated regions, coupled by a decline in the amount of natural vegetation. We're going to see a growing population, Africa being a young continent, also having to compete and deal with the decreasing or diminishing amount of resources across the continent, across our various regions of the continent. And then third is obviously the complex shifts in spatial distribution of the remaining natural vegetation types. So in areas such as West Africa, we're seeing decrease in woody vegetation, people's ways of life and ways of existing in these spaces is going to be impacted and will need to be adapted and will change. Add to this the impact of anthropogenic land use, human land use, what we're doing to the land, how we're using the land with regards to our predominant agricultural practices, grazing, large parts of the continent also requiring fuel or wood as a source of fuel. Add that with the natural climate variabilities, the changing in human-caused climate change, you start to see how the ways in which these various things interact will also have lasting and lasting consequences. I think something which obviously is also not taken into account often enough or spoken about is the change in coastal systems, the change in the way of life for countries along the coast, for the ecosystems and the ecology of those areas also, particularly in a country such as South Africa, which is surrounded by coastlines all around it. We will see the exacerbation of the stresses which are currently being felt by diversity loss, pollution, habitat degradation, and coastal erosion increase. Coastal systems are also obviously going to be impacted by rising sea levels. I think in the past, when we spoke about climate change, rising sea levels was something which was at the forefront and continues to be, particularly for island nations and coastal nations such as us. But I think sometimes with regards to some of the other impacts that we face, particularly the heating, the increase in droughts, and some of those other conditions, it may fall lower down the ranks in terms of something we need to contend with and the ways in which it will impact the communities that live in these areas, but also the country more broadly with these rising sea levels. So an example for this is also what happens with storm waves. In 2007, saw storm swells of up to 14 meters, which were caused by cyclone-generated winds, which coincided with a high astronomical tide of 2.2 meters. We're going to see a frequency increasing of these kind of cyclonic events off our coastlines, particularly off the east side of the country. We've seen it in recent years, particularly off the coast of Mozambique, and how these events have impacted further inland in provinces such as Mpumalanga and Limpopo. But obviously, province such as KZN will also have to contest with how that will affect not only the inland parts with regards to events such as cyclones, but also the tidal effects that will happen along the coastline of that province and the communities that are positioned there. Some of the estimates that were put with regards to this 2007 storm gives you a figure with regards to some of the economic costs that we'll be facing with these changes and some of these impacts were an estimated losses of up to $100 million at that time. So the other effects that we also have to take into consideration that would work in conjunction with some of these events are flooding of river delta areas, an increase in migration to coastal cities due to a lack of resources due to droughts and things of that nature will also make coastal areas particularly vulnerable to other hotspots. As I spoke about right now with regards to the cyclonic events, we can also expect extreme rainfall events. I think that's obviously something which has become more salient this year than ever for us in this country, seeing what has happened and also seeing how vulnerable we are, particularly to these extreme rainfall events. I think that with regards to droughts and the frequency of the droughts that we've had in the past decade, and the semi-arid conditions that the country faces and the lack of adequate water provision across the country, we have become a bit psychologically primed to how these effects of droughts and heating and dry conditions have affected us. Not that we've become any better at a governmental level in being able to address these issues. I think, unfortunately, also being able to psychologically contend with the impacts of extreme rainfall events is something quite harrowing to think about when we see what we've gone through this past year. Just a little bit of some figures with regards to the economic cost of these changes and these impacts, beginning with what I said at the start about our particular economic and infrastructural vulnerabilities. When you take into consideration that under moderate and high emission scenarios, you could see between 131 to 197 billion rands worth of expenses by the middle of the century or in the next coming decades. And under a high emission scenario, our country could lose up to 13.5% of its GDP, over half a trillion was called again by the end of the century. So just to hammer home some of the things that we've spoken about in this forum before closing off, in terms of how we think about responding to this and the way in which we deal with all these other competing crises and alternatives in being addressing them, thinking around mitigation and adaptation and understanding that these are political decisions, these are not politically neutral pathways, the way in which our government is orientated towards understanding and thinking around these issues within the political sphere, it is imperative that we continue to understand, contextualize, and put into the mainstream when we think around some of these other issues, cost of living, and some of the other socio-economic issues that our country continues to grapple with, that they must also contend with the coming challenges of continued and exacerbated climate impacts. And at the Climate Justice Charter movements and within the space, we continue to advocate for transformative solutions, such as transitioning to solar, socially community-owned renewable energy, enhancing access to climate jobs, and building a new food system based on food sovereignty. I will end my presentation there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Awande, for such an important input. We have been for a very long time calling for the government to put this country on a climate emergency footing and to adopt the charter as per section 234 of the Constitution. But as Awande's presentation has shown, our calls have been taken with a lackluster approach by the government. But we have made some very important inroads because Parliament did not have rules on what should happen when a charter is presented before Parliament and calls are being made for Parliament to adopt it as per section 234 of the Constitution. So with our calls for Parliament to adopt section 234 of the Constitution, we got the Parliamentary Rules Committee to start drafting laws and procedures and rules on what should happen when a charter is presented before Parliament and calls are being made for it to be adopted as per section 234 of the Constitution. So although Parliament has not adopted the charter as per section 234, but we've made important inroads in strengthening our democracy and in making sure that civil society is not ignored by Parliament. So thank you very much, Awande. And Dr. Ferrial Adams, over to you.
Thank you so much, Charles. So one of the things that I will be talking about is water, and in particular the Climate Justice Charter movement, developing an alternative water policy. And so I don't have a presentation, but I will talk to the points that that we have. So in starting out is that, why do we need this alternative water policy? And what's really great about the work that we've been doing as the CJCM is that not only are we identifying the challenges and the problems that we're facing, but we're also providing solutions. And so this water policy stems from the climate challenges that we are facing, and that Awande has spoken to quite in detail a few minutes ago. It's also related to the state of our water resources in South Africa. And then the next reason is that we have some really good policies in the country. So we have good, there's 4 pieces of legislation that kind of is the umbrella of all kind of water issues. But the implementation of water policy in countries is very poor. And that is something that, we need to reflect on. That's why we're looking at an alternative water policy. If you just think about A lot of these policies, the National Water Policy, the National Water Act, the Water Services Act, were all produced about 24, 25 years ago. And if you think about the extent of climate change, the impacts of climate change, the fact that we are living climate shocks, and also the fact that we are in a water scarce country and it's not getting any better, that we need to review our policies because they're not going to be working as well as we'd like to. So those were some of the thinking around an alternative water policy. And then also in terms of, for us as the CJC, that, you know, looking at what the charter talks to about democratizing the water commons. This document is then going to say, how do we do this? What are the principles that we need to have in place? Some of it, for example, is to advance systemic alternatives in communities, villages, towns, cities. And you know what? When we started writing this, I would say a year or so ago, it was, you know, it felt like pie in the sky, but these things are happening on the ground. And every day we see more and more examples of people taking control over the areas in which they live because they know that government is not going to be able to service or deliver. It's also about ensuring that it's not a water policy that is a top-down approach, because we've seen that that doesn't work. So we want to ensure that community and there's workplace participation in a deep just transition. It's not something that's talked about outside and we don't have a role in it. Another thing is when you're dealing with environmental issues and water and climate change, there's the aspect of science. And I think sometimes that locks people out of being involved. And we're saying that through this policy, we want to democratize science. We want to raise consciousness and empower people to make the difference. There's also, one of the principles is a respect for local knowledge. So if you take climate shocks, climate change, some of the local knowledge has actually been used to see how we adapt better. To explain the experiences that we've been having, to actually monitor the climate shocks that we've been having. So we cannot discount local knowledge and local experiences. Also, we're saying that it's not an individual kind of response. We have to have a collective, radical, non-racial, and gender-conscious leadership at all levels of the movement. And those are the principles of this alternative water policy. And the reason I'm raising that is, and we'll come to that in a minute in terms of the present water policy. I was going to talk about, so part of the water policy, as I mentioned, is to respond to the worsening climate crisis and the importance of having a water commons. I'm not going to go through quite a bit of that because I think Awande has covered that quite a bit in terms of the impacts of climate change, climate shocks, the cost to the country, the cost to us as people. But just to say that we are running out of time and that large-scale societal change has to happen fast. We're dealing with a corrupt state, a failing economy, and increasing climate shocks. And all of these have to be addressed at once. We can't silo them. This means that we have to build from within, alongside and beyond the current system. Building from below is key. And it is important for us to actually get people's voices from the ground. In terms of local leadership, it's crucial. I think that we can't, I think that the mining movement has used the term not about us, without us, and we need to live that. And that's also part of the policy and that we want to engage with. And I think all of this stems from the Climate Justice Charter. It's very much the principles of the Climate Justice Charter, and it will be the principles of our working documents as we go, especially our alternative policies that we are developing. So that is, that is the motivation. But I just want to add that, when we talk about the state of our water commons in South Africa, I think we also need to understand where we stand. And why it's so important that we need to have an alternative policy, because the present policies are not working. Yes, we are in a water scarce country geographically. So we have an annual rainfall that is far below the global average, right, of 860 millimeters. About 98% of our water is already allocated to industry, agriculture, residential, but it's allocated. We don't have room to play. So when you have a drought like we've been having, then you have the day zeros, and that's the challenge. More and more cities and towns are heading to day zero, and government plans and foresight is just, it's appalling. I mean, Nelson Mandela Bay, we knew about the challenges that they were going to be facing when Cape Town was hitting day zero, but the planning was just like, now you come and it's like, oh, it's a big shock, but really it shouldn't be a shock. We knew this was going to happen. So the onslaught on our water should have us all on high alert, because it's not only the shortage, it's also the pollution. You know, I don't know if people follow, but the Blue Drop report, which looks at the quality of drinking water, the Green Drop report, which looks at the state of wastewater in our country, it's shocking. And I'm worried. I was listening to Mervyn, and I was like flabbergasted with some of the amount, you know, that he was telling us about the cost of food. Then you listen to Awande and you talk about the cost of the impacts of climate shocks. And now you look at our water system, which is what we need to survive. And more than 60% of our wastewater treatment plants are in critical state. About 52% of our water supply is in critical risk. You know, there's high levels of microbiological elements in it. So we are actually, besides all of that, we have high levels of E. coli, rising acid mine drainage, and we're losing about 40% of our fresh drinking water into leaking pipes. So clearly government is not, the 4 core pieces of water legislation, the National Water Policy, the National Water Act, the Water Services Act, and the National Water Resource Strategy. You know, they have elements in them. We mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The bathwater with it. Anyway, you know what I mean. But there are elements in it that are good and that do, because these policies were set up and they were developed by progressive people who were looking at trying to redress past inequalities. But it has not been updated and it has not been implemented. But also, it has been, I would say, it's been taken over by a neoliberal approach to water. So even when you talk to, you know, Hein will talk to his book, but there are elements in the book that he talks about. You know, when you talk about a UBIG, we often think about an income grant, but it's not just about food. It's not just about a house. It's also about having subsidies for water. It's about having potable and accessible sanitation and potable water. So it's more than just a grant that, oh, this grant's going to give people food, but it's also about building on that to have services that people can afford and that can be subsidized for low income. So we have that, right? We have our policies talk about a free basic electricity. We talk about free basic water, but the way it's implemented is piecemeal. Different municipalities do it differently, and there isn't some kind of a system that puts in checks and balances that people will not be cheated out of their free basic electricity and water. So we're saying that in terms of an alternative policy, what are the types of policy measures we need for a deep, just transition? And one of the things we're saying we need to look at KZN. We need to look at the climate shocks we've experienced over the last 2 or 3 years. And we need to learn from those lessons. We're not learning from those lessons. So the water policy should explore various measures that can contribute to democratizing our water and give it a real sense of what democratizing our water is. It must include an environmental focus. It must have a review of the financing and cost of water, because we know that big business, etc., are using huge amounts of water. They're polluting the water, and there isn't an adequate kind of cost to that. Our water infrastructure plan is appalling, and it needs community voices. People need to be able to say and participate in how our water infrastructure is developed and water policy. And part of that, just for an example, is we really have to have people's voices on the ground being heard, because what is happening, and I'm seeing this more and more and more, is that our water treatment plants are failing. They're spewing E. coli into the rivers, and what they're doing is they're then kind of privatizing. So I don't know if people know, but it's called a package sewage plant, which is a small sewage plant, but it's a privatized sewage plant, and that can deal with smaller amounts. And you can have all these package plants opening up all over, but they privatized. And I think that on the one hand, yes, we're in such a mess that we need to look at stuff, but we're also giving room to open up the doors for privatization. We saw that with the energy speech that the Ramaphosa made. I mean, it's definitely leaning towards privatization, and that's something we need to be very aware of in terms of water. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about. We're also saying that an alternative policy on its own could become as bad as present policies. It must be accompanied by education to ensure that people are empowered with the knowledge to make informed decisions. Community members must be urged to join water investigations and research so that there is shared knowledge and that people have ownership over that knowledge and information. There's a lot of people that don't know the state of the water that they're drinking, the quality of the water that they're drinking. We need to change that. Municipalities have to monitor water, but those results are sent to national government. Surely we should know, we should be told whether or not our water is fit to drink. Because with the stats I see from government's own Blue Drop and Green Drop report, I'm surprised that more cities are not saying we shouldn't be drinking our water. So that is what we're saying in a nutshell, the alternative water policy should be about. But we want to look at it, and this is the area that I'm still working on, and I'm still busy writing, is that what should be the role of government in an alternative water policy? What should their role be? What should be the role of communities? And I've outlined some of that. But also, I think we need to take into account workplaces and sectors. So areas that agriculture, for example, that uses a lot of water. How do we monitor that? We don't have access to monitor that water until, unless we have government telling us on water use licenses. But how do we incorporate a water policy that allows us to have checks and balances across the board and to be able to monitor pollution wherever it is? I know that industries along the Henot River, they just release pollution into the river as if it's a sink. And well, it shouldn't be a sink, you shouldn't be releasing pollution, but we've seen water turn white and blue and green, and we can't hold anyone accountable, and we don't know where these are happening. And that's why it's so important to create this awareness across the board and in workplaces as well and sectors. So this is the alternative water policy we're working on. It's a work in progress. We hope to have it completed by the end of September. We will be having comments on it. But I think that for me, the important thing about a policy is to rethink water, is to, as the Climate Justice Charter has said, is to become part of that whole system of democratizing, and that we have a right to discuss how our water is going to be used. Right now, there's a lot that's been happening without enough of us objecting. And I think that is why often government can go the privatized way. My fear is that if we're not careful, our food's going to be privatized in terms of seeds, our water is going to be privatized, and our air is going to be privatized in terms of what they're doing with climate change, and our energy is going to be privatized. And then I think the poor, the costs that Mervyn mentioned earlier, the costs that Awande mentioned earlier, is just going to be more than we'll ever be able to handle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adam, for that input. Thank you so much to Mervyn Abrahams and Awande as well. What our three initial panelists have shown us is that we are facing a convergence of crisis, and that our understanding of a UPIC is not that of a technocratic, isolated policy, but part of a democratic and systemic reform. I'm excited to hand over to Awande, who will chair the next session, which is the launch of Hein Marais' new and exciting book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. And I'm happy to switch to this part of the webinar today, as we speak about what Charles has just said also, is a democratic systemic reform, a way in which we take into consideration all the things that we've just spoken about, all the challenges and issues that we're dealing with at a socioeconomic level, and to be able to address them in a way that meets and also expands the rights that people have in terms of the standard and quality of life that they deserve. So to introduce our speaker, Hein Marais is an independent writer specializing in political economy, development, and public health. His previous books include Push to the Limits, The Political Economy of Change, South Africa, Limits to Change, The Political Economy of Transition, as well as Buckling, The Impact of AIDS in South Africa. His new book, In the Balance, The Case for a Universal Basic Income in South Africa and Beyond. And just to read briefly the blurb at the back, as jobs disappear, wages flatline and inequality grows. This timely book presents a compelling analysis of the need, conditions, and possibility for universal basic income in South Africa and beyond. Highly topical and distinctive in its approach, In the Balance is a robust and critical examination of universal basic income, placing debates in the urgent context of the crisis of work, floundering economies, global warming, social upheaval. Hein Marais' approach shows the relevance of UBI in conditions of gross inequality and pinpoints what it will take to implement and sustain such a policy. So without much further ado, I hand over to Hein Marais. Thank you.
Thanks, Awande. Thanks to everybody for joining, Copac for organizing, Michelle, Vish, Jane, Charles, for various ways supporting the writing and the research that went into this book. I'm going to try and summarize some of the key points or issues that I think are relevant to our discussion here today. I'm going to try and do it in less than 25 minutes, necessarily touching on some things and skirting past other things, but perhaps we can come to them when we turn to discussion. Look, as we've heard, we are dealing and living through a succession of multiple upheavals: ecological collapse, multiplying disasters associated with global warming, infectious disease pandemics. In South Africa, we're fighting 3 at the moment: TB, HIV, and COVID-19, deepening economic instability and social precarity, and faltering political and governance systems that are failing us as citizens and societies. Our lives, our societies, the very conditions for life are being transformed, and these upheavals will continue, but they'll do so in unpredictable ways, which means that piecemeal responses are not going to be enough. Neither are nostalgic strategies trying to recover or replicate idealized instances from the past. It's not going to save our skins. What we need are more creative, long-lasting changes. This is essential. Now, in the South African case, this grim outlook is projected onto a reality that already resembles a kind of dystopia. And we have an economy that generates vast and well-distributed wealth. And it does this without the paid labor of about half of the working age population. For perhaps a majority of low-skilled workers in South Africa, working life is basically a series of short periods of employment bracketed by unpredictable durations of unemployment. This is not an aberration, not temporary. Unemployment has exceeded 20% since at least the 1970s, and very likely before that. We don't have the data sets to really test that statement. But we're living proof here in South Africa that labor is becoming less and less significant to how the economic engine of capitalism functions, as David Harvey has put it. And the result of this is we have a population, half of which lives at or below the upper bound poverty line set by Statistics South Africa. That's about 30 million people. Roughly half of them, 14 million people, are classified as extremely poor. In other words, they cannot buy basic food items. But not only are jobs scarce, having one also doesn't mean you won't be poor. Large proportions of employed workers earn wages that are so low, so unreliable that they need subsidies from family members and the state to survive. We have a situation where close to 1 in 3 workers with paid work do not earn enough to regularly afford their basic living expenses. And roughly 1 in 5 workers in the formal sector who have a job live in poverty. So it's quite clear, more jobs and more decent jobs are desperately needed, but any strategy that relies exclusively or even excessively on that quest, economic growth, producing jobs, is going to be tragically incomplete. We have many millions of South Africans trapped between a social order that insists that they sell their labor to earn any chance of dignified life, and on the other hand, an economic system that only needs the labor of a fraction of them. These current systems for distributing income, in other words, are both inadequate and they're inappropriate in this kind of world of instability, a world that's been hammered by successive calamities. So we have to think seriously about appropriate alternatives. We have to be as radical as reality itself, in words of Vladimir Lenin more than a century ago. And I think there's a strong case that a universal basic income, what I'm just going to refer to as a UBI from here on, should be part of this thinking of alternatives. Now, what do we mean by a UBI? It's a slippery concept. You find it has advocates and critics from right across the political spectrum, and they all have different ideas about what a UBI is and what it should do. And this slipperiness has allowed a potentially radical concept to enter mainstream debate, which is why we can read about it in practically any publication nowadays. But behind these different ideas about a UBI are different sets of interests and different goals. Now, generally speaking, a UBI would be a regular, most probably monthly income that's paid unconditionally to all individuals, most likely adults, without means testing or a work requirement. That's what makes it universal. And that's the kind of UBI that I discuss in my new book. Now, for libertarian and other supporters on the right, a limited basic income payment would replace most other forms of social protection. For progressive supporters, among whom I count myself, a UBI would supplement, it's in addition to other social entitlements, such as free healthcare, as Ferrial mentioned, free water, sanitation, transport and housing subsidies, and so on. And really importantly, it will occur as part of overhauled industrial, labor, and macroeconomic policies. It's not a standalone intervention, as Awande has reminded and Charles has reminded us a couple of times now. This supplementary feature is absolutely vital. A UBI is not a cure-all, and we should not be thinking about it in that way. If we approach it as a standalone technical fix, we'll be sacrificing its potential, and we'll be leaving it to possible capture by interests and forces that are anathema to the kind of society that we're committed to building. It's an intervention that can have a transformative impact if it is used as part of a broader set of strategies to build a just and viable society. Now, very briefly, what potential impact can we expect a UBI to have? We can expect it to reduce poverty levels, reduce household debt, and we know this from the various UBI pilots that have been run and assessed, and the findings analyzed. We know that some cash transfer programs. All of this I set out and discussed in considerable detail in the book. Depending on how it's financed, it could also reduce income inequality. It will almost certainly also improve other social outcomes, including maternal and child health, enrollment in schools, schooling performances, mental health. And we can expect it to boost aggregate demand for basic services and goods, which in turn can stimulate local economic production and labor demand. It does not lead to idleness. It does not stop people from working or seeking work. There is absolutely no empirical evidence for that claim. And it does not lead to increased spending on what economists call temptation goods, alcohol, cigarettes, narcotics, and so on. A UBI can enable us, though, to choose paid work more freely, rather than being forced to take whatever's on offer under the threat of hunger and homelessness and precarity. It's been called a kind of permanent strike fund, a reserve that can help us hold off on taking a job out of sheer desperation. Now, if workers have the freedom not to sell their labor at the going rate, It can therefore help shift the balance of power between them and employers. There's a rich debate going on about this effect in the labor market that a UBI might have on the ability of worker organizations to thrive. And I discuss that as well in the book. If a UBI tightens the labor supply and it increases the reservation wage, by which I mean the lowest wage at which a worker is likely to perform a given job, if it has that effect, it can drive up wages at the bottom end of the wage spectrum. But importantly, a UBI can also enable us to use our labor and our time and our energy for other purposes, at least part of the time. And these can be care and other socially useful work. It can be studying, acquiring new skills. It can be participating in community activities. A number of things can come to the minds of any of us as we sit here today. And it can underwrite and bolster community resilience. Can a UBI support strategies we need, some of which we discussed earlier today, to manage the climate change shocks and to advance a just transition? I think it can, but I think we should not exaggerate that potential. The transition away from a fossil fuel-based economic model will not be frictionless. It will disrupt and it will affect the lives of workers and their communities. And that effect, these costs of economic restructuring tend to be distributed very unequally and very unfairly across communities, across workforces, and across geographies. And I think a UBI could be important for helping us prevent that kind of inequity, prevent the costs of what will be necessary industrial restructuring from being unloaded onto workers and their communities. It potentially speaks to a few areas of key concern. An income payment that goes beyond the promises of retraining and reskilling, that's tangible, predictable, that's regular, can help counter the jobs blackmail tactics that are routinely used against the environmental justice movement. And it can help counteract potential resistance among workers and their communities towards restructuring, precisely out of fear of what it would mean for their ability to put food on the table. A UBI can support activities that support resilience, social reproduction at community level, things like local food production, mutual aid networks, artisanal and repair work, cultural production, various forms of organized social solidarity. So more than just reduce poverty, which tends to be the way in which the mainstream debate looks at a UBI, it can support community level resilience and action. And in that way, I argue in the book, can become an important component of a just transition. And a component is the important word. It is a part of a wider strategy of achieving a just transition. So in sum, a UBI is more than a social policy tool that we use to alleviate or reduce poverty. It has transformative potential if it is made part of a broader push for social and economic change. I want to just quickly look at this transformative potential a little more closely. I go into some length in the book on this issue and some of the debates around it. Now, I've already suggested that a UBI can strengthen low-income workers' bargaining power, that it can have a liberating effect against the coercion of the labor market. Other claims are also made that in relation to a possible effect on the gender divisions of work and so on, who performs most of the care and other work within the household. But I think what's often missed is the transformative potential that comes from the ways in which a UBI and the debate around it requires us to question cornerstone beliefs about the current order. Because baked into the UBI I discuss in the book is an understanding that factors beyond individual control decide the distribution of means and resources and opportunities. And it confronts us with the failings of a social and economic order in which waged work is the core mechanism for distributing income across society. It challenges this insistence that paid work is the obligatory condition for entitlement and social inclusion, for us being social citizens. So a UBI in this way upsets a whole set of commonplace beliefs about the centrality and the authority of waged work in our social order, and about the hierarchies of worth and of value that we attach to different types of work, whether paid or not. It also forces us to rethink I think, in fresh ways about the responsibilities and the entitlements that connect us in society, about what sorts of claims we legitimately have on one another and on the state, and about the core roles and duties of the state and communities. More than that, I think the universal nature of the UBI implies that value, and this is an important point, value is produced by society as a whole, that the entirety of society is entitled to a rightful share of the wealth produced in it. This, I think, has huge implications for how we frame the demand for a UBI. And I want to argue, and as I do in the book, very briefly here today, that we need to take our demand beyond and our concept of a UBI, beyond the idea that it will reduce poverty. The framing of a UBI, I think, is going to be fundamentally important for the kind of UBI we eventually achieve. Is it an appeal for charity, for the state to grant assistance in extreme circumstances? Or do we say it's a claim that arises from rights written into the Constitution? Or is it a claim for what we are due, for our just dues? Now, I argue that a radical perspective would frame a UBI as a social dividend, as a share of the collectively produced wealth in society. This kind of framing steers the debate beyond arguments about who deserves assistance, who does not, when do they deserve it. A UBI becomes an income that is paid as a rightful share of collectively produced wealth. Similarly, we can think of a UBI as a form of just dues or remuneration for the unpaid work performed by women over the centuries. If we think of a UBI as a rightful share, then nobody is giving anybody anything, as James Ferguson has put it. One is simply receiving one's own share of our collective property. This way of thinking is attractive in a rentier economy like ours, and it's especially appealing in a country where the economy has been built on systemic dispossession and exploitation across the colonial and apartheid eras and continuing subsequently. And it's also in tune with powerful traditions of politics on the left in South Africa. Thinking of a UBI as a social dividend also emphasizes its collective character, rather than seeing it as this multitude of separate payments going to individuals. I think all of this has profound implications, because once a UBI shifts from being seen as a grant, as a concession that's handed out by the state, once we see it as a rightful claim, it implies a different relationship between citizens and the state, and it potentially also destabilizes the privileged relationship between the state and capital. If we present a UBI as a social dividend, it becomes a demand to democratize the surplus that's produced in our society. And this also spotlights a crucial question that surrounds a UBI demand. Which sets of interests are going to be powerful enough to decide on the purpose of a universal basic income, on its design, on how it's financed, how it's implemented? And which set of interests will be powerful enough to defend those arrangements? The impact and the fate of the UBI will depend on how it links with other economic, social, and political strategies of change or of opposing such change. Which forces drive those strategies and whether they are capable of defending desired changes. There are deep, fundamentally important political questions folded into our push for a UBI. Very briefly, I can't skirt past the issue of affordability, and neither can I touch on it or discuss it in any depth here today, given the time available. But a UBI will be expensive. How expensive depends on the amount, on how eligibility is defined, on the design, how it blends with or replaces certain other entitlements. Is it considered taxable income? And how it's phased in. Careful costing estimates have been produced. The Institute for Economic Justice has done sterling work on this, and various scenarios for implementing are being floated. You can start with a small amount that increases along the schedule or as specified criteria are met, or by steadily widening eligibility. All of this will affect the answer to the question of affordability. There is no rightful way of saying and pronouncing that a UBI is unaffordable without answering and investigating these other aspects. Various financing options are also being teased out. And importantly, they put a lie to the idea that a UBI will require large increases in personal income tax. there are numerous other fiscal options and mechanisms available. Carbon tax, tax on financial transactions, land value tax, resource rent tax, and other forms of fiscal savings. All of this I discuss in the book, and a lot of this work is ongoing elsewhere in the world as well. In conclusion, tectonic shifts are underway, and they're sweeping us along. We cannot change that fact. We have to go beyond thinking in terms of recuperation, of turning back the clock, of building back better, of applying fresh paint to failed strategies. In the case of South Africa, at least, there's no golden age to be reclaimed. A serious look at a UBI, I think, has to feature in the search for strategies that can get us through what lies ahead. There are risks, there are unanswered questions, there are huge challenges attached to a universal basic income. We should get it. How big should it be? What makes it affordable? How do we prevent it from being used to chip away at other social entitlements and public goods? How does it compare with, say, a jobs guarantee? Are the two compatible? I discuss all of these and other important questions in some detail in the book, and spoiler alert, they don't all resolve into simple, clear answers, at least not for me. And that's fine, because I think we won't know the answers until we've examined rigorously with a clear head an intervention which, unlike any other on offer at the moment, confronts a singular yet hidden fact that paid work is not available or a viable basis for dignified life in South Africa anymore. And there is no sign of that changing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have some time for some brief questions. So if anyone would like to ask any questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand. I would just like to use my privilege as chair to throw the first question, perhaps, and just to ask for you to just go a little deeper with regards to some of the more encouraging trends that you have seen with regards to how people have taken this idea of the social dividend and its transformative potential in changing what it means to be a person in society, moving beyond social citizenship being tied intrinsically to paid work.
Thanks, Awande. Shall we just go question by question and wait for others to?
I'll take a question by question and wait for everyone to just have some time to think up their questions. Okay, absolutely. The idea of it being seen as a social dividend is, I think, being most clearly articulated by Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek economist. And it's been taken up in, at least in debate and theorizing around a UBI in the European context in particular. There's no UBI, as you know, existing anywhere in the world at the moment. We have a series of pilot projects that have been staged and ended. A lot of them have been short-lived. We have some that are called universal basic income grants, but in fact are not. Many of them are still targeted and means tested and so on. And most of them are still being employed or attempted in the context of it's seen as a form of social welfare. They still tend to be, at least from the state's perspective, to be regarded as a form of concession making, seeking and handing back to citizens who need it in times of distress. So this proposal of it being seen as a rightful just dues, as opposed to something that is handed to us, granted to us, no wonder we call it a social grant, is an untested one in reality right now. I think my argument, and the point that I want to stress in perhaps skirting your question, is that how we push forward with the demand for a basic income is a fundamental constituent element of the kind of basic income we're going to end there. That how we think about it, why we have a right to it, is fundamentally important. We have to get beyond this idea that it's something we ask for or that we need in times of distress. It is a basic just dues that we are owed as citizens of society, whether we work for a wage or not. And if we can get that way of thinking, that debate going, I think it also encourages us to start breaking down
this wall that we've erected between paid work and unpaid work, between the work that mostly women perform in the household, for example, and in their communities, and the work that people who show up and punch their job cards at work perform. These are increasingly false and porous divisions, and I think we need to break them down further. And the UBI, I think, is one exciting way of helping us do that.
I think those are really powerful points in terms of how we push for it, how we fight for it is also a constituent aspect of what we gain and what it becomes. I think that the way in which you phrase it, particularly when you're looking at reproductive work, unpaid labor done by most women in societies across the world, the idea and the notion of a social dividend is so important there also in terms of how we rethink and reshape society, particularly seeing as we're living within the legacy of the industrial age and how we think around our work, how we think around our lives and what it means to be a person in society, how we fight for it, how we push for it, as you said, could lay the foundations of a different future in a different way in which society can be constituted. I see a question from Ann Knott. Ann Knott has her hand up. You can just unmute there, Ann.
Okay, thanks. I'm from Extinction Rebellion, Nelson Mandela Bay. I had quite a lot of questions, but the chat was disabled. But what I'd really like to know about is these theories of degrowth. This has been mooted quite a lot in the Climate Justice Coalition. And the notion of decolonization, and perhaps Hein could speak to that.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to speak to it very briefly by saying that it's not an issue that I go into in great detail in the book. I try to keep it as compact as possible. It comes in around 200 pages, so as to not be too daunting. It's a vital issue in the long term to develop a coherent and rigorous theory of degrowth. And as you would know, it is also subject to sometimes withering critique from the left. It really does divide us on the left in significant and important ways that I think require clear debate. I am going to admit to you that I'm agnostic on this at this point. I lean towards sympathy for it because I do believe that in the long term, it is the only possible way for us to make our way through the decades of crisis that lie ahead, that we cannot keep growing industrial style economies structured on capitalist grounds and effectively survive in a civilized manner what lies ahead. But at the same time, if I pitch myself my thoughts across the next decade or 2 decades, I find it very difficult to translate that vision into a practical series of steps that are implementable right now. I without any shame, admit that this is an issue that I'm still trying to work out in my own head.
I think also just to add from the climate perspective also, and I think that's also how Anne is maybe also thinking around it, and that how we shape our societies to deal with that crisis and to deal with this challenge, that degrowth in and amongst other concepts, post-growth, pluriversality, is a necessary thing to debate and think around. And I do think that there's been a lot recently that's been written around it that is quite helpful for us to think around some of our challenges in conjunction with a UBI. But there's also enough for us to debate with regards to the way in which some of it has been introduced into the debate, mainly focusing on global north, but also with regards to in relation to the global south, but not necessarily focusing centrally on what that means for the global south. But I do think that it's quite an important concept to think around, particularly with regards to what we're speaking about right now in UBI, rethinking how society is constituted, But I think that the idea of growth neutrality is something which is also a necessary thing to introduce in terms of adding to the degrowth debate. I see another hand here by Marcus Solomon. Marcus, you will go when you're ready. Hi, Marcus, I think you're unmuted. You can throw your question in. Okay, I think Marcus might be having problems with his mic. Marcus, perhaps if you're unable to speak, if you can just add your question into the chat, and to anyone else who may be having a similar issue, please just throw your question in the chat there. I'll just throw a question to Hein in the meantime, whilst we still try to get Marcus there. With regards to the research and work that you did into this book, and being able to explain and give such a clear picture with regards to what UBI is and how we can think about it in this current moment. What were some of the challenges that you encountered in writing this book with regards to compiling this information? What were some of the more challenging aspects of that?
Thanks, Awande. I think one of the things that struck me was that most of the evidence and most of the thinking around UBI has been coming from the North. That there's been very little rigorous thinking about making a demand like this a practicable, a realistic demand with costing estimates, with various scenarios for implementation, for various financing options. Very little of that coming from the South. South Africa being an exceptional, an important exception to that over the past 2 or 3 years here. And I really do want to highlight the work of the Institute for Economic Justice on this, and the work of Ashkar Aitolzade out in California on this. I think that the work that's been done here at the moment is pretty much cutting edge. The other thing that struck me was how there is still, despite the proliferation of basic income pilot studies, a lack of a long-term database, data set that we can test some of our assumptions and hopes on. So what we're working with are, in many cases, in trying to tease out the benefits, the kinds of advantages we can expect. What we're working with in many cases are analogous programs, cash transfer programs, many of which are conditional and or targeted and or means tested, which I think gives us only a partial insight into the kinds of benefits that we could expect from the UBI. I think those benefits would be greater than what we are seeing using these analogies as our sort of guiding data sets in there. There's one interesting long-term project underway on the shores of Lake Victoria in Kenya at the moment, which I think runs across 12 years, or it's intended to, which will be an interesting addition to that data. The other thing that struck me was wrestling with, on many occasions here, was the animosity on the left towards the UBI, and almost at times reluctance to engage in a polite debate about the concept. There's a knee-jerk response that I've encountered that this is just a form of kind of neoliberal trickery, that it's just going to commoditize and sink us deeper into the market economy. And I've been, I think, initially quite disappointed at this lack of dialogue between those in the left who hold that position and those like myself who believe that there is more to be discovered in the ways in which we approach a UBI. That's been the part of discovery as I was researching and thinking and debating it, some of the things that struck me, that stood out.
I think it's quite interesting, South Africa being an outlier in the global south with regards to this this topic, and I think that it provides a really interesting space for us within our context to kind of guide and lead a conversation from a global south perspective with regards to this, and maybe that would be quite useful in also shifting some people's perspectives on the left with regards to how they think around it. And I think that maybe some of the misgivings that people may have in the knee-jerk reaction is probably as a result of the kind of Silicon Valley dominance in this conversation. And I think that you spoke about it quite a while in your presentation about like the conservative approaches to this. And I think that there's a way in which the global south perspective being able to change and expand people's ability to engage with this issue and allow for more constructive debate. We have a comment here from Marcus who says that we need coordinated approach. We're working in silos. And another comment from Nora who says that National Treasury rather than the province, as National Treasury has the capacity, if VAT is used as a source to finance the big, the amount paid to taxpayers can be recouped from those taxpayers who qualify through the amount that they already earn. And a question here from Helen Chapel, who says, would it be easier to implement or institute a big or a UBI at provincial rather than national level?
Let me start with the latter. Easier, I cannot say, and until we sort of investigate the hows and means for doing that. It is one of the ways in which an incremental approach to UBI is being floated, that we don't necessarily, I'm not just talking about South Africa now in general, that we don't necessarily think about a big bang UBI right off the bat, that it's phased in a staged and incremental way. And it might well be that this kind of geographic limiting of it is one way of doing it. It has huge implications, though, not only from the financing side, but also from its impact on people's behavior. There was a pilot study, quite famous one, run in a village community in Namibia several years ago, back in, I think, 2007. And what they found there was that the payment was a small amount, 100 Namibian dollars, caused family members to move into this community from other regions in there, so that the GDP per capita in this community dropped significantly, people moving in. But at the same time, the poverty rate dropped, school attendance rates rose, hospital admissions dropped, etc. So it has effect. It's not just a neutral intervention, a mechanism that just gets plopped into society. We respond to the incentives and the attractions that it offers to us, and that will have to be taken into account if there's any geographic limit that we place on it. I just want to respond briefly to Nora's comment about using VAT as a way of financing a UBI. And those of us who are a little older now will remember 20 years ago the attempt to have a basic income grant, the campaign for that, and this was one of the financing options that was floated at the time. I think, and I argue this quite strongly in the book, we have to be very wary about using VAT increases. It's a regressive form of financing. It largely because lower income individuals and households end up paying larger proportions of their income, devoting larger proportions of their income to VAT than a higher income person does. So there's an inbuilt inequality that gets redoubled, that gets compounded if we rely on VAT as an important financing mechanism. I really do urge that we start looking and thinking more seriously about forms of financing that are fiscal-based, fiscal options, that involve tax restructuring, but that go beyond this idea that individuals, either as personal taxpayers or as contributors through value-added tax are going to be the main source of income for a VAT. It doesn't have to be like that. There are other ways of tapping the wealth, to come back to the issue of framing it as a social dividend, tapping the collective wealth that's produced in the society that can provide us with a basket of funding for a UBI.
I think that's an incredibly important point, which goes in line with what you're saying about how we fight for a UBI can also shape what it becomes, but also how we finance it must not be framed in the now, in the short term, but we also have to think about how the financing of a UBI can help reshape the economic structure of our country and the way in which we think about the economy. It's just as important in the ways in which we begin in that financing and the financing that will lead to it later on. I am wary of the time, but we have one final question here from Vish. It says, Hein, can you say more about how UBI challenges us to think beyond the imaginary of employment or jobs? There is a renewed debate on the left on this issue linked to the role of digital capitalism. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I have some rough and undigested thoughts to share on that, not necessarily linked to digital capitalism specifically. Let me just say very briefly at first that I think South African reality, social reality in South Africa already confronts us, forces us to think beyond the imaginary of employment and jobs, as Vish has put it here. The sheer fact of living as a poor person in South Africa, and that means millions of South Africans, confronts us with this fact day in and day out. The challenge for us is to release ourselves, to liberate ourselves from this myth, this fiction, that somewhere out there in the future lies a reality where jobs are going to be available and are going to be paid and provided on terms that enable us to have some kind of dignified life. I think this is the break that we have to come to terms with, the reality that we have to come to terms with. And I wouldn't load too much of that duty, this duty of ideologically releasing us from this fiction on a UBI. But I think in debating why a UBI is needed in South Africa, in stating the need for it and the conditions that create that need, I think it becomes very clear that somehow we live in a society where massive wealth is produced. And at the same time, we have a vast number of supernumeraries, South Africans whose labor is simply not useful and necessary for capital to produce this wealth. I mean, in a sense, the fact of South Africa today already ruptures this imaginary. What hasn't happened is we haven't managed to do it in our own way of thinking about in relation to society, of ourselves in relation to each other. So we end up resorting to notions of seeing a grant as a handout, of seeing a UBI as a concession, of seeing it as a form of dependence on the state. And I think in all these respects, and I go into considerable detail in the book about the idea of deservedness, about dependency, about reciprocity, what we owe each other, and on what terms we owe each other. I think a UBI forces us to start thinking freshly about these things. It's not going to necessarily drop the scales from everybody's eyes, but it opens the debate. And I think it's an absolutely vital debate for us to have beyond the issue of a UBI, because South African reality and the outlook we have, the prospects we can look towards in our country, is one in which waged work is and will be a minor part of what allows us to remain a possibly viable society. We're on the brink of losing that possible part in there. And I really do hope that in this debate, the struggle to bring about a UBI, that the debates that we have around it confront us clear-headedly with these dilemmas, that we cannot think about us in relation to work, to capitalism, to the state, to those around us in our communities and societies in the ways in which capitalism, industrial capitalism, schooled us and taught us to think.
Thank you, Hein. I am aware that we've gone over time, and I think that's a perfect place for us to end on. Just to re-emphasize that, South Africa and where we are, the challenges that we face in the post-apartheid era and the challenges that we have yet to meet. It is important that we do have that work with regards to rethinking those possibilities, orienting our understanding of what the solutions can be and how our society should be shaped. And I think that this topic of UBI and also your book is an important intervention in doing that work and in helping others, activists, movements, policymakers, academics, to also do that work, and hopefully also the political leadership in this country. And for everyone, once again, the name of the book is In the Balance, the case for a universal basic income in South Africa and beyond, by Hein Marais. So please, everyone, do get yourself a copy. And I want to thank you, Hein, for taking the time out today to be with us today, but also taking the time to write this book, which I think that we'll be talking about for years to come. I think it will be very foundational in the work that people are doing, and for us to be able to achieve this basic income, this universal basic income. So once again, thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you, Hein, for your time. And I look forward to seeing everyone in the future at our next webinar. So thank you once again, and goodbye.
Thanks to everyone. Bye.